Thank you all for coming to hour 2 of Epicenter. And I'm going to introduce someone who is going to introduce our next speaker. I want to make sure that you all know who Christy Howell is. Christy, yes, applause. Because Christy has done the bulk of the work organizing the Epicenter Conference. She does a great job with that every year. And this would not happen without her organization, without her tireless effort, and hauling people to Niecy's Soul Food Restaurant in Kansas City. Anyone ever been to Niecy's?
Oh, come
on. Okay. We should get an endorsement deal from them, right? Okay. So with that, another round of applause for Christy, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Jay. So I have the great good fortune of introducing Dr. Skylar Bayer. I'm sorry, Skylar Young Bayer. I know. So Skylar is Dr. Skylar Young Bayer from the University of Maine. I'll go into a little bit of what she's doing now that is curious, and hopefully she'll talk a little bit about that with us later on. You may recognize Skylar from some work that she's done on why the sex life of our seafood matters, that she's done with TED, and that she did on the Colbert Report a few years ago. But Skylar's focus here today is going to be to talk with us about science communication, and more to the point, the idea of storytelling and how the stories that we tell each other and the ways that we interact with each other when we talk about things about which we're very passionate can help us build better relationships and better communities. And she's going to talk us through a very important relationship that she had with a guy named Andy May. She may also talk with us a little bit about Story Collider and Strictly Fish Wrap, 2 projects that she's been working on to help us tell those stories a little bit better. Right now, Skylar is on a fellowship with the Sea Grant Consortium, a group that's very near and dear to my heart as a Mississippi Gulf Coast Sea Rat. And she's doing policy work in D.C., so we should give her an extra round of applause for putting up with both the heat and humidity of D.C. and everything else, right? So welcome, Skylar.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me out here. I didn't know anything about Kansas City till I arrived here, but actually my grandmother was born here. So it's kind of nice to come back and see it. So the first thing, I can't help it because I've taught, and I'm going to give you an outline and tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to tell you, and then at the end I'll tell you what I told you, which is actually key to actually giving a good presentation, I was told. So we're going to do a thought experiment first, which means I'm going to ask something of you. Then I'm going to tell you 2 stories in which you will learn nothing, to borrow a line from my friend Aaron Barker, who is the executive producer of the Story Collider, who I still do work for. I'll get into that a little bit later. We talk about shared values, benefits of storytelling, and sort of revisit that thought experiment and sort of conclude with what I think is important. And hopefully I won't go too over time. So first, for our thought experiment, I want everyone in this room to close their eyes. I'm serious, close your eyes now. This is so that you don't judge each other, basically. I want you to close your eyes and envision when you hear the word scientist, who do you see? What is that model scientist in your brain? Okay, so I'm gonna ask you 3 questions now. Keep your eyes closed, all of you. This is the part where I don't want you judging each other. And I'm going to ask you, if you agree with something, to raise your hand, and if not, keep your hand down. So the first question is, raise your hand if that person that you're envisioning as a scientist is someone that you think you can relate to. Okay, you can put your hands down now, keep your eyes closed. Now that you've been thinking about who that person is, raise your hand if you see a scientist as a possible future self, that you could see yourself as a scientist. Okay, great, you can put your hands down. This is the last question, and then I can actually talk to you. Raise your hand if you think that scientists that you envisioned at the beginning could communicate well or be close with a person who does not share the same beliefs in science. Okay, you can keep your hands down. Now you can open your eyes. This is for my data collection purposes. I was actually kind of impressed. All right. So I'm going to tell you a story. Again, you will learn nothing from this. There's no learning involved in stories, as we well know. About my origins and where I come from as a scientist and how I've gotten to where I am now, because if you understand more about me, maybe you can understand where I'm coming from a little bit in my value of storytelling and communication. So the first thing that you really need to know about me is that when I was born, I had a relatively rare condition called transposition of the great arteries, or TGA. And what that means is that when you're a fetus, your heart does a certain number of twists. This is what I was told. And my heart didn't do the last twist. And what that means is, I made this diagram actually out of cut paper for a different talk, but on the right side here, you see the TGA heart. And what's happening is that the heart is a pump for two systems that are parallel next to each other, but they do not connect. And what that means is that deoxygenated blood from my body just circulates back to the body, and the oxygenated blood that it would be oxygenated by my lungs once I started breathing just goes back to the lungs. And eventually I would die if I didn't have surgery. And so this is a congenital defect, which means I got it in the womb from whatever environmental variable my mother experienced. And I was really lucky. I was born in Boston, at Boston Children's Hospital, and I had surgery, and some of the best surgeons and experts in cardiology are there. And I have a huge scar down the middle of me. I go in for checkups regularly, and I am very much chained to the New England area, partly because I don't really trust going to see other doctors. Not yet, anyway. So why does this matter? Well, I was very interested in biology from an early age because of this, because I was born with this heart condition. I wanted to know about biology. I wanted to understand why I had a heart defect. And I was also really interested in reproduction because I was born with this congenital defect, but my brother was not. And why was that? What affects reproduction? So that was a very big motivator for me as a child, and then on to my early career. The other thing, I can't really explain why or like when this happened, but I became fascinated with the ocean. Absolutely fascinated. I've actually never been to the Houston Museum of Natural Science, but I love this picture because this is what was going through my mind as I read through picture books as a kid. I wanted to see those giant squid and those whales fighting it out underwater. I wanted to go to the bottom of the ocean. I wanted to see the wreck of the Titanic. I wanted to know about all the creepy things crawling around down there. But I also really didn't want to go down there because it was really scary. And I would probably die, right? Because, it'd be some sort of incident like in the abyss where a good amount of people die in that. But I was just so fascinated, and I just really, really wanted to learn about all the animals in the deep sea and explore. So I envisioned that my future would be something like this, where I would just be hanging out on the ocean as a marine biologist. I would get to go scuba diving all the time. That's actually a picture of my dog. But it's sort of the eagerness of looking into the future, and that this is what my life would be like, from day one of stepping into college. But things were not that easy. For one thing, I did not grow up with parents who could afford to go scuba diving. Scuba diving is very expensive, and in college, where I went, I found is that there wasn't really a training program for it. And I couldn't really afford the gear, I couldn't afford the dive time, I couldn't afford to go to the Caribbean. All that my parents did have, they poured into our education, but that didn't include things like scuba diving. And a lot of the internship opportunities, professors were looking for students who already could scuba dive. And so friends of mine like Laura, who had been scuba diving since they were 12, were perfect candidates to go to the Galapagos and all these amazing, amazing places. And so after my sophomore year, during my sophomore year, I was applying to internships, tons of marine biology internships, and I was rejected from all of them, just all of them. And my hopes and dreams of being a marine biologist were on the edge. But I had a pretty good advisor who was a marine biologist, and he said, why don't you just do an internship of some kind of biology or ecology, some kind of research? He's like, that's going to carry a lot of weight that you did any research. It doesn't have to be marine science. There's a lot of biology that overlaps the terrestrial and marine fields. So there was a posting in our department for going to the Arctic in Alaska on the tundra to study soil chemistry and nutrient cycling and the effects of climate change. And the interview was really funny because I found out later the grad student didn't even look at our resumes. She was just deciding who she could live with in a tent for 3 months. And I'll never forget, at the end of that summer, she was like, well, yeah, you and Ben, I both really liked your hair. And so I chose you guys. I was like, you chose us for our hair? But so I spent this summer like building greenhouses, living in the Arctic. I'm in a full bodysuit there because the insects are just vicious and will eat you alive. You had to wear like a baseball hat underneath it though, because otherwise the netting would be all over your face and they'd still like get you. And I didn't know anything about soil, but we do these cores and we'd homogenize the soil and learn what we could from the chemistry. And it was really cool. I really loved research, but I still really missed the ocean, and I still really missed working with animals. And this sort of just a representation of those things. This is me gawking over really giant oysters in the Pacific because they don't get that big in the Atlantic. And I really wanted to be on boats and stuff. So I continued to apply to things, and I did SEA semester where I sailed across the Pacific. That's a whole other story. But then all that afforded me the opportunity to work at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution because I'd had some sort of research experience. And I got to work in a lab that studied deep sea hydrothermal vents. And on a particular research cruise, a postdoc, she was pregnant and she couldn't go, so I took her spot. And I actually got to go in Alvin, the submarine. Have you guys heard of Alvin? Yep. The wreck of Titanic, the submarine that goes down there. A lot of things that get a lot of press where people actually go down in submarines. It's usually Alvin. And I actually got to go 1.5 miles below the surface of the ocean to a hydrothermal vent, basically off the coast of Mexico with these two guys for 9 hours. And it was one of the most amazing days of my life. I actually ended up telling a story about it later if you want to hear more about it online. And I got to see like one of the most amazing parts of this dive. On the right here, these are all tube worms that live right at these hydrothermal vents. They're not found anywhere else. And they kind of look like this like twisted rose garden. You know, they have this like white bone tubes that twist and turn, and then they have these feathery dark red gills where they basically make food from the chemicals in the water because it's just filled with hydrogen sulfide, which most of the organisms we know can't live with that. But one of the best parts of that trip was at the end of our like dive on the bottom, the pilot Bruce is like, so did you see everything you wanted to see? And I was like, well, I guess, yeah, like I feel like I'm being greedy if I, ask for something else. I got to go to the bottom of the ocean. And I was like, well, I'd really like to see a Dumbo octopus. And then this Dumbo octopus just shows up like 15 minutes later. It was just this really incredible trip. But while I was at Woods Hole, there was something that sort of like ached in me about the fact that I felt like what I was doing didn't relate enough to people. I had taken this course in college called Human Impacts on the Ecosystem. And I had learned, about a lot more about climate change and all these things. And one of the big things that I cared about was overfishing. And one of the years after college, I had read this book called The Unnatural History of the Sea by Callum Roberts. And it's all about how we've completely overfished the ocean and all the ways we've done it and the repeated cases time after time again. And one of the things we say in fisheries management is fisheries management is not about managing fish, it's about managing people. So when it comes to trying to help bring fish populations back, you don't just need to know like the biology and ecology of the system, you really need to know about the people, because a lot of these people depend on it. So you can't just take it away from them, you have to work with them for solutions. And that was something that was really desirable for me. So I left MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution with a master's to go to University of Maine to study sea scallop populations, to study their reproductive ecology. And sea scallops are a very important inshore fishery in Maine. Maine might be the only state that actually has a state fishery. The rest is all federal, which means it's all way offshore. So, I wanted to experience this. This is a lobster boat off the coast of Maine. And they had a dive program. And I was going to be a scuba diver. I would have the money as a graduate student. I even actually took a course at Woods Hole. I did 6 months of training. This is what I wanted for my future as a scientist. I would get to work on a fishery species, learn a little bit about the people, but most of my time would be spent scuba diving and, going to beautiful places like this. This is a sideways view, but you get the picture. It's very pretty there. In the summer. But then something happened. I got really sick and I got hospitalized and I had these like weird little arrhythmias in my heart, which scared me because I'd had heart surgery. So I was like, what is wrong with me? I'm 25 years old. What's wrong with me? And I go and I have a long, crazy experience at the hospital, but I find out that I have this thing called polymorphic arrhythmia, which just means many-formed arrhythmia, which means they don't know, but I just have some weird electrical issues. When I was born, I had plumbing issues, and they fixed that, and then I had electrical issues now, and they don't really know how to fix that. So I had an ICD, or basically a pacemaker, implanted about almost 7 years ago now. But the big fallout for that was that I was no longer allowed to scuba dive. And I worked in a scuba diving lab. And I just started my 6-year PhD program. So what that meant is I had to rely on everyone else to collect a lot of my data. I had to shift my priorities. I could drive the boat, I could plan a dive, but I could not collect the data. I could do the lab experiments, I could go to fishery meetings, I could do everything but the scuba diving, which was the sexy part of the job. And so one of the things that happened, so this is a picture of me like on the boat doing lab experiments, and then that's a cartoon drawing that a friend of mine on Twitter drew of me with my work. Those are sea scallops. They have a lot of eyes. And I'll get into more about them in a minute, but one of the things I really got into was science communication. Twitter's free. I lived in the middle of nowhere in Maine. I could access people across the internet. I could get mentorship, help, ideas. There was just so much there for me because I couldn't scuba dive, so I wanted to be able to fill that skill. And then I thought more seriously about developing relationships with fishermen because now I could maybe had more time and energy to focus on that stuff. And this led to things like storytelling. At the Story Collider, that's me and my husband actually telling a story of when we met. And then this is me interviewing my dog with a microphone. I started a podcast. She wasn't very talkative. But it led to all these opportunities. So that's sort of where I am now and why I'm invited here. So, you didn't learn anything there, I hope. So I want to tell you a second story, which is very important to me because I think without my fisherman friend, I would not be where I am today for a number of reasons. So during the second year of my PhD, I kind of wanted to create a backup project. And this is me and Andy, you can't really see our faces very well, hauling up some scallops in a bucket onto the pier that he had just collected. He lives in Mount Desert Island, which is sort of like on the other side of the state coastwise, and we wanted to see if reproduction was happening at different times of the year because I was really interested in reproduction for my thesis work. And a lot of my work had to do with fertilization, which is really risky because there's a lot of reasons why, but either the timing, the scallops, they don't spawn when you want them to, and eggs and sperm are really small, but water washes them away. And then we were trying to measure them in the field. So we're trying to measure like these 100 micron little particles, if they got fertilized by a 10 micron particle. And, you know, a lot of the time we're like, oh, I hope if whatever we put in the ocean actually comes back, never mind if we get data from it. So I wanted to get all this data from dissections, and he was going to help me do that because we could find out what was going there. And so this is a picture of a scallop with their ginormous gonad there. That's a female. It makes up like 30% of their body weight during peak season. So they're very fecund. So one of these days, while I was working with Andy, I was getting all the collections from him at the end of the season, getting all his data, all these little gonads that he had cut out, preserved in formaldehyde, a giant bucket of it. And we're going to meet at a gas station on Mount Desert Island. And I pull into one side of the parking lot, and I'm like trying to like call him, but there's no service because it's Maine, and there's no service in like 50% of the state, especially in like 2011. And I'm like, where is he? Where is he? And I see him pulling across the street, and there's a doctor's office, and he had mentioned he was going to drop his kids off there for an appointment. So I run across the street, and I say, Andy, like, here I am. You can give me the samples now. And he's like, well, I already put them in your car. And I was like, well, and I like look at my dog in the back seat, and I'm like, well, we did not get any samples. And so he points to the other side of the parking lot, way across from where I was parked, and he goes, oh, I put it in that car with the university plates, and the car was gone. There was no car. It was just like, you could see the aura still, like taking up atmosphere. And, I was just like, oh, shit. And my first thought is my advisor's going to kill me, because that's like how you think as a grad student. And he's like, oh no, he's like, the doors were unlocked. And in Maine, you have to understand, no one locks their doors. It's just like not a thing. And so it was very easy to just slip something in the back of someone's car. Like that's such a Maine thing to happen. And so he like turns to me with his like big, like gnarly fisherman hands, and he says, don't worry, Skylar, I always screw stuff up, and then it always turns out okay. Maybe we'll make a friend out of it. And I was sort of like, yeah, maybe. And I call the university, the carpool lot, to see who was out there. I call all these like researchers, because there's a research institute over there, and like calling all these people, and no one at the university knows where this car is. And part of it's we're worried because there's formaldehyde in these samples, and we don't want people opening them up and like getting sick or whatever. And what Andy does, he talks to his wife and Michelle calls me, and she goes, oh, well, I filed a police report. I called the radio station. I posted on Facebook. What else? I think she wrote to the paper. She's like, maybe all this media attention will help us find it. And it did. The Facebook post was seen by the professor who had been driving the car. And so she ended up calling Michelle, and then Michelle called me, and I coordinated with a friend to go to the university to get these samples. But the thing is that in the meantime, the press had like picked this up. And she had never explicitly said in these ads that they were gonads, right? They were guts. They were scallop guts. So a lot of the headlines were like, man loses guts, And then the local paper did a piece on like the Facebook connection part. But the Associated Press picked it up. And we were like reading papers in like Houston and San Francisco and Seattle with these like little like man loses guts thing. And I had a blog, Strictly Fish Wrap, at the time, which no one read, and that's fine. It's called Strictly Fish Wrap for a reason. And so I was like, well, I'll write a post about it. And I wrote, well, I'm actually the owner of these, and I'm a woman. And, that wasn't really important, but I was a grad student. And they're not just guts, they're gonads for my research. And I kid you not, within 24 hours, I got an email from a producer at the Colbert Report being like, hi, we're very interested in this story. Would people be interested in being interviewed for it? And I was like, I thought it was a prank. I looked it up, who is Nicole Savini? Like, this can't be a real person. But it was real, and I was excited. I mean, first off, it was my parents' favorite show at the time. But also the story was just so silly and innocuous, I couldn't see how the Colbert Report would really skewer us for it. And I wasn't sure if Andy would be interested. And one of the reasons is Andy does not believe in climate change. He's very conservative. He, he is not pro-choice. These are all values that that tend to line up with who I am, and, I'm very liberal. And there are all these things that we do not have in common at all, and I didn't think that he would necessarily be a fan of the Colbert Report since it makes fun of conservatives. But Andy also has a really good sense of humor, and he's the guy that stands by you no matter what. And he says to me, he's like, Skylar, you want to do this? I'm right there with you. I'm on board with you on this. This is hilarious. I think this is great. I will do it. And this is interesting because the people at my university whose values are supposed to line up with mine, no one wanted me to do it. No one. PR department, I understand why. PR department didn't want me to do it. My advisor told me he didn't want me to mention his name, that if I burned alone. The director, I know, the director didn't want me to do it. No one wanted me to do it. I got zero support. I mean, my friends and family, they were supportive, but it's different than getting professional support. But I did find a couple of science communication people that I could practice off of. And so the results of this, they came and filmed, and we didn't get to see anything until 4 months later. And this is Andy, and this is a screen grab that's probably illegal from the episode, and you guys should watch it on your own. And it was hilarious. It was so well done. Nicole did such a good job of putting together as a murder mystery piece. Andy was the one who looked, hilarious and goofy, but that's who he was anyway. And I was the serious scientist who obviously had a sense of humor, but I was very good at being the straight man. And it was this thing I took a huge risk on was something that defined the rest of my science communication career, because I was like, well, I took this really big risk, went on national television, didn't screw it up. I think that I would probably be okay at speaking in public and working on science communication things and trying a bunch of things out, trying podcasting, trying to talk to fishermen more. And I actually gained a lot of respect from the fishermen community because they thought it was great. Everyone thought it was great. And even my university wishes that they had been mentioned in it, but they weren't. Because they explicitly didn't want to be. So, and I understand that I have empathy about it. But Andy and I remained friends for a long time. And in the last 3 years, he actually got diagnosed with very aggressive cancer. And I went and visited him during chemotherapy. And he would still go scallop diving while on chemo. And doctors, are you nuts? And he's like, well, underwater is the only place where I feel free and can forget about the fact that I have cancer. And this past December, he finally had a tumor in his brain, and I visited him in hospice, which was hard because Andy is one of those people that you think can survive anything. And he died just a few weeks after that. But I went to the memorial service, and his dad, who's probably in his 70s, comes up to me and gives me this huge, huge hug. I've never met the man. And he's like, oh my God, that Colbert piece was one of the highlights of everything to celebrate about what Andy was like and who he was. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for doing that. And it was one of those moments that I just wasn't prepared for because I didn't understand, I think, how much it meant to his family and his community too. And there's a great article about him. If you're interested, there's a URL in the Maine magazine all about him called Scallop Diver for Life. So that was a very important relationship with someone that I never would have expected would be so important to me in my life as a scientist. But we did have shared values. We shared the value of protecting the fishery. We cared about that together. We cared about, even though he didn't believe in climate science, he believed that science was helpful for helping protect the fishery and responsible management, making sure the fishery existed in the future. And actually, these two values I learned are important when talking to people about climate change, according to a workshop I went to recently. And if you're interested in that, I can give you more information about them. But we also had a common sense of humor, which was very important. And we developed a lot of trust. And that's really key for these relationships that you develop with community members. And so to sort of shift to sort of the broader view of sharing those values is the benefits of storytelling, right? Like our brains, and I think Andy mentioned this earlier, where our brains are wired for absorbing stories, and there's actually a science of storytelling you can find online. But it's when you tell someone a story, if you give them a description of like leathery hands or something, the sensory part of their brain actually lights up. So it's like they're experiencing it when you tell them that story. And it's easier to relate to someone's life because you can, when you hear a narrative, you tend to try to envision, yourself going through the same thing. And sometimes someone else's stories become your stories, and you forget where the boundaries end. And then, this may seem common sense, but we tend to, when we talk about our day or explain things, we tend to talk about things in a sequence of events, and that's what stories often are. And you'll probably do some of this in the afternoon. And you become a human to your audience. And for scientists, that's really important right now, because the classic view of a scientist may be someone that you can't relate to. So let's revisit that thought experiment that I had you do earlier. What I had you do is sort of a very short version of this study that came out recently where students in community colleges in California were asked to do this thing called Scientist Spotlight, where they would read a paper by a scientist and then hear a personal story, or it was like a TED Talk or a Story Collider story. And they would do this homework where they were asked, can you see yourself, is this one of your possible selves? Can you relate to them? How do you feel about science? Are you interested? And at the end of the semester, after the group that did this homework felt that they could relate to the scientists, or at least some of them. You don't have to relate to all of them. You can't relate to everyone. But there are scientists that you might share common experience with. And then this also affected the interest in science in course grades. And again, if you're interested in this paper, I can send it to you. So, one of the conclusions of this is that connecting to anyone about science requires finding common ground first. Something you care about, something you value, that is just key. And then sort of the other thought, too, about this that I think is important is each one of us has more than one story. This is like the back of all my business cards from a couple years ago, and this is just to articulate, these are all very different pictures, and I like to think of them as, possibly different stories. There are so many sides of you. You're not just a scientist, you're not just a mother or father or a friend, or you're all of those things, right? You're more than one dimension, and so you have multiple ways to connect with different people. And it's good to remember that, how you connect with one person about, I'm talking about science, but it could be anything, might be completely different than with someone else about the same topic or value or idea. So that's sort of the final thought I want to leave you with. So thank you for your time, and that's all I have.
The cube is still here. All right, on one of our phone conversations, you talked about the importance of empathy. And that's certainly implicit in everything you just said. But maybe you could say a little more explicitly about how empathy helped you as a scientist make connections that otherwise perhaps you wouldn't make?
Yeah, I didn't get to talk about all of my stories. Some of them are on the Story Collider podcast, but so some of my experiences, like having my heart diagnosis, having to deal with physical limitations, I think that has probably made me more empathetic to people who have similar issues. I failed my exams, my oral exams the first time, and yeah, it's another long story. But I've had, and my father had a stroke, and I've just had a lot of adult experiences in 5 years. But the thing is I probably didn't go through what other people have gone through. People go through way worse, but I think the more experiences you have that are adult and serious and real make you a more empathetic person. And so one thing that, like, at least with some students that I've met in undergrad who haven't experienced anything yet, sometimes they have a harder time relating, but that's not always true.
All right, questions from the audience? All right. See if we can go 2 for 2.
When you're using stories to relate to, relate climate change to an audience, you find that there's a certain length of the story? I guess it depends on the story, but is there a certain length that you shoot for? Is it 5 minutes, or what do you look for?
Well, first off, I'm not a climate scientist, so in terms of climate change, that's more of a side topic. But if you mean like my research in general, I study reproduction, and actually it's not as sexy as it sounds a lot of the time because it makes people uncomfortable. But usually metaphors are very critical. I try to go for shorter things in general because you tend to get a wider audience, but sometimes, it's different. And scientific audiences are very different than the general public, or even, this group is different than probably other groups I've presented to. I guess I don't have one answer, but if you're thinking of a particular example, maybe I can comment more.
With regard to, when I speak a lot on issues in the developing world and climate change, and there's just a lot of stories there. So it's always a trade-off between the number of situations you can present and, frankly, how much they can absorb.
Yeah, and so one thing I would say is it's like know thy audience. I can never remember the name of this guy that came up with this, but it's like when you're presenting or communicating, it's like know thy audience, know thyself, and know thy stuff. And the audience part, I think, is one of the most important parts of that in terms of how much you can get through and what's the important part. And in some cases, I think Andy was talking about, with climate change, sometimes the solutions or what's important aren't necessarily the most direct environmental, pollution thing or something. Maybe it's getting girls through high school or whatever. So, and I think that ties back into know your audience, and know thyself, because someone asked me, they're like, oh, you're funny sometimes. Should I be funny to be good? And I'm like, well, if it is, you don't have to be a certain way. You should develop your own style and do what works for you. You shouldn't just try to emulate, someone else.
All right, Paul, how are your reflexes?
Real quick question. Are you a fan of the moth?
Oh, yeah. Well, so the story collider is based.
Are you a fan of the moth?
Yeah, the story collider is based off of the moth. And I didn't get to talk too much about the story collider, but I told a story for them at a science communication conference in 2013, and they really liked it. And then I invited them to produce shows in Maine, and then they're like, well, why don't you help produce? And then I now screen stories for them and stuff, but the moth is very similar. It's way more well known and broad and popular, but it's good. It's really good.
Okay, I was just gonna ask if there's a certain book or person that you've learned all of this from that we could search out to learn more and develop our own skills, or is this something that you've learned and experienced through life?
Well, I'd say the workshop in the afternoon you're going to do, I did that 4.5 years ago. I did a full day workshop, but those kinds of things are really good. There's so many books and information out there. It kind of depends what exactly you want to do, because there's lots of different kinds of storytelling. The Story Collider is a really good resource for examples, especially if it's about science and storytelling. There's Randy Olson's book, right? And there's, depending what direction you want to go. And for me, I've tried out a lot of different forms of science communication because I wanted to figure out what I liked, and you can do that. You don't have to do just one kind of thing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a starting point.
All right, do we have another comment from Andy here?
I love this. I'll just say, just to add to this, there was a hashtag that went around on Twitter a few years ago that started with a physicist, a doctoral candidate at Caltech, a woman, and the hashtag is "I am a scientist because." And when I talk to scientists, I encourage them just to answer that, fill in the rest of that sentence. "I am a scientist because" is a great way to start a conversation with an audience that's not scientific. And it gets right to these points that Skylar has been making so well. And Randy's got this ABT thing. It's and, but, therefore. Anytime when you're saying, I went to the market and I bought some eggs and I went back and I cooked an omelet, that's not a story. It's and. And he learned from Trey Parker at South Park. There's a video on YouTube of Trey Parker and his colleague at South Park explaining to some NYU students how to write a script. And they say, anytime you replace an and with a but or a therefore, that's when you're telling a story. It's those turns, and that's just ABT. Randy Olson can lead you to lots of stuff.
Yeah, and I will just add, like, all stories have, like, a timeline, right? Like, my first story has a timeline, but it's usually good to avoid my whole life stories for things like the Story Collider, but my second story has a pretty strict timeline. So a series of events happened over X time, and usually there's a climax, right? And a lot of the time it's like this build up, and then the thing happens, and then usually you want to get out of that story real quickly. Like, you don't want to wax poetic forever about, all the meanings of this thing, because a lot of the time the story is supposed to speak for itself. So I didn't try to overinterpret the stories I told you, because I want it to connect to whatever emotions that you have inside your heads that you can relate to. I'm not going to tell you how to think about it. I mean, I kind of did an experiment on you. So, and that's the thing with stories is, like, it's different than a lecture, and it's different than others. It's not speaking. We like to call it telling. So I could go on, but you guys want to have lunch. And also the workshop this afternoon, I didn't want to overlap with that too much, but you'll get some really good material out of there on some storytelling basics, I think.
So we didn't work out this segue, and I have a little pitch, and then I actually have a question for you. But my name is James Ray. I'm here with the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, and that's the afternoon workshop. It's, as Skylar mentioned, it's a sort of an hour and 15-minute version of a longer workshop we do that touches on a lot of it's going to be a wonderful segue from what Skylar said and what from Andy Revkin said earlier this morning to take those ideas and get you all. And I've been given permission to open the floor up to anyone who still wants to come to that workshop this afternoon. If you haven't signed up, down in the room downstairs at 12:45, 12:50, 12:40-ish until about 2. So please come, and we're going to explore a lot of the ideas that both of the morning speakers have brought out and how to make an impact with this stuff. So, by the way, Laura Lindenfeld says hello.
Oh.
She's the director of the center. My question to you is, you, by default, sort of presented very much of who you are as a person on this stage, though you also are a scientist. Could you speak to this group? Obviously, in our work, you see, and I think all of you have probably seen this, wherever you are, whether it's a AAAS conference or whatever it might be, a reluctance to bring yourself to the stage, to your presentation, that you bring the scientist, but you don't bring the fisherman, the father, the mother, the husband, the bike rider. You know, it's the one-dimensional self. Obviously, you seem to be a fan of the whole self as part of any sort of presentation. Can you talk to, I don't know, the success of that? Have you seen it work well in more scientific settings, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of science, so like 15-minute presentations or 12-minute presentations at a science conference, you usually, if you have room for a joke or something personal, it's great, but a lot of the time you don't. But yeah, I feel like that's a cultural thing, because I think in science in general, it's been like, we are all about the work and we do not have feelings and we're objective about everything, which is, total crap, because we're humans and humans are subjective, and, like, we have tons of issues in science institutions today with diversity and accepting different ways of living your life, like maternity leave, like all those things. And it's because there's this cultural, like, well, we're only one way and emotions don't matter and stuff. And it's changing. There's people working really hard to change it, and I would like to be part of that change in that future, because I think that's where it's going. But I also just think it's like humanism. But when I give like a 12-minute research talk, like, I might make a comment here and there about how I feel something, which does actually happen quite a bit. And actually, the more senior people are, the more they feel they can, make some terrible joke. Or sometimes they're very good. Or they don't adhere to the normal presentation of, introduction methods, results, whatever. They'll tell you a story about the research, which you can apply a lot of the same principles, but I think it's easier to start with personal stories because you know your experiences so well, and then to work towards using that in your work, which I have done. I didn't specifically do that today. It takes a lot of time because you want to be truthful, but you don't want to bore your audience. You want them on board with you and to be able to relate. And that's, I think, where a lot of the hard work comes in with the in-depth research that's not as straightforward as you think it is, and making it accessible. And that's not as easy as it sounds. Or maybe you don't think it's easy, but it's a lot of work. I hope that answers some of your question.
Okay. I think I just have maybe one last question to close off, which is a bit of a continuation of, I think, the last point. And so we envisioned our scientist, right, with your thought experiment. And some folks may have had a Bill Nye type or someone in a white coat, lab coat, or whatever the case might be. And there is a kind of, particularly the lab coat and the university scientist sort of has this kind of veneer of inapproachability, of separating oneself from other people, a position of authority, right? So how do we teach people who are going to become scientists that the PhD or that process, which is inherently isolating and creates this kind of sense of autonomy and distance, how do you move away from that to being more comfortable, being authentic, being genuine, being empathetic?
Right. Well, I feel like a lot of students start out that way in grad school as a real person, and then they get told that everything else should be shamed and put in a closet. But I think people going in public and sharing their experiences, and like I made a point of like talking about my stuff that I went through in grad school and talking with other students, and I still have former undergrad interns, especially women, sending me notes asking me how to deal with things. And like if you're open about your problems, you can get better direction and mentorship and support. There's like a huge mental health problem in grad schools. There's another article just came out about it recently, and I think part of it's because people don't think they can talk to anyone about the fact that they're a human being and they have problems or they're struggling. So I think that there just needs to be, I don't have like one answer, but I think continuing to put people out there. The Story Collider has been a great success in showing people that scientists are humans, and we do struggle with some scientists who think they can't. They've been doing it for so long, of doing presentations just about science, that they really have a hard time putting their whole self into it. And that's just a cultural thing that needs to change. That's what I think.
Okay, I'm sorry to keep it going on here, but I think we should talk a little bit, maybe like this be the last question, about gender and science, right? I've been really interested in reading some of Sarah Meyer's stuff on Twitter. So what's your sense as to how attitudes about women in science are changing, about role models, about mentorships? I mean, how's all that, or is it changing in your mind?
I think that there is some push for change, but the people still at the top leadership positions are often not interested in that. Like, you'll see in biology, there's so many female grad students and whatever, but then, there isn't an infrastructure, there isn't a support system for if they want to have a kid, or they're discriminated against because the way they like to communicate is with respect instead of aggression. I've had to learn to be very aggressive with certain people in my field because that's the only thing they respect. And so, you know, and that includes shouting matches, which are not professional, but and some of that's changing, and the push needs to be there, and there needs to be support for, you know, honestly, like one of the biggest things I think is just making it more family friendly too, because people want to have families, male or female, and there just needs to be the support for it. But again, a lot of those people making the decisions, making the most money, running the institutions, that percentage is still pretty low of, you know, at least women, and then other minorities. I mean, and that's a big challenge too. So, I mean, I think it just needs to keep pushing. And I honestly think like the way institutions run is the biggest part of it. If there's no support network, if there's no money for it, if there's no social support, you know, we're social animals, we need that, then you're not gonna make it, because no one can take that kind of abuse forever. And if you do, some people get so bitter about it that they think you should have climbed through the same horrible ladder, and they pull the ladder up instead of giving you a hand to pull you up the mountain. And that's like an analogy we talk about. And I understand where that perspective comes from, but I just don't think it's helpful for the future. So.